I have nowhere else to go. A storm tears across the Colorado mountains. A widow, clutching her shivering child, pounds on the door of the most feared rancher in the county. He's a giant of a man, known for fists and silence. Yet, instead of turning her away, he opens the door and says, "You're home now, but mercy has a price." The richest family in town claims the boy as their heir, and the sheriff himself is ready to drag him away. Gunfire echoes near the corral. Church bells toll with warning. And as the child's life hangs in the balance, the rancher must decide whether he'll stand against the law, kneel before a higher justice. Whispers of betrayal, a healer from the Ute people, and a community torn between fear and faith. All collide in one question that will change everything. Will a single act of kindness be enough to build a family, or will it cost them everything they hold dear? Before we begin, share a piece of your world in the comments. Your city, your energy. It's a powerful thing, being part of something bigger than ourselves. The bitter winter wind howled through the Colorado highlands, rattling the wooden walls of Boone Carver's isolated cabin. Inside, he crouched before the stone fireplace. His broad shoulders hunched as he carefully arranged another log on the dying flames. The fire sputtered, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn floors and simple furnishings that marked a solitary man's existence. A sudden pounding at his door cut through the storm's wail. Boone's head snapped up, his weathered face tightening with suspicion. Few folks ventured this far into the highlands, especially in weather fierce enough to freeze a man solid. The knocking came again, more desperate this time. Boone rose to his full height, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle propped beside the hearth. As he approached the door, a woman's voice carried through the wood, thin and trembling. "Please, someone, anyone, help us." Boone hesitated, his calloused fingers resting on the door latch. In town, they knew him as a man best left alone, quick with his fists and shorter still with his words. But there was something in that voice that spoke of real fear. He pulled the door open, and the wind nearly tore it from his grip. There on his porch stood a woman, her dress soaked through and her dark hair plastered to her face. In her arms, she clutched a small boy who looked no more than 6 or 7 years old. The child's lips had taken on a bluish tinge, his thin shoulders shaking violently beneath his threadbare coat. "Please," the woman said again, her eyes wide with desperation. "My boy, he's so cold." Boone took in the sight of them, the widow and her son, both looking like half-drowned sparrows blown in by the storm. Every instinct honed by years of solitude told him to turn them away. This was his sanctuary, his carefully guarded peace. But as he watched the boy's trembling form, something deeper than instinct stirred in his chest. Without a word, he stepped back from the doorway, making room for them to enter. The woman didn't hesitate. She hurried inside, carrying her son straight toward the fireplace as if drawn by its warmth. Boone closed the door against the howling wind and watched as she sank down onto the worn rug before the hearth. "Thank you," she whispered, rubbing her son's arms briskly. "I'm Annalyn Townsend, and this is my boy." Boone grunted in acknowledgement, moving to the pot of stew that hung near the fire. He'd made enough for several days, as was his habit. Now, without comment, he took down 2 extra bowls from a shelf and began ladling out portions. The boy's coughing broke the silence, a wet, worrying sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Annalyn pulled him closer, murmuring soft words of comfort as she helped him out of his wet coat. Boone brought them the bowls of stew, along with 2 spoons worn smooth from years of use. "Eat," he said gruffly, then turned to gather some quilts from the chest near his bed. When he returned, Annalyn was helping her son with shaking hands to spoon the hot stew into his mouth. Her own bowl sat untouched as she tended to him first. Something about that simple act of motherly devotion made Boone's throat tighten unexpectedly. He draped the quilts around their shoulders, trying not to notice how Annalyn flinched slightly at his nearness. No doubt she'd heard the stories about him in town, Boone Carver, the mountain giant with fists like hammers and a temper to match. "Your husband?" he asked, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. Annalyn's hands stilled for a moment. "Dead," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on her son. "We have nowhere else to go." Boone moved back to his chair, settling his large frame into the familiar worn seat. He studied them in the firelight, the widow with her proud bearing despite her circumstances, the boy who was already beginning to show some color in his cheeks as the warmth and food did their work. "You're home now," he said simply. Surprising himself as much as her with the words, Annalyn's head lifted sharply, her eyes meeting his for the first time. In them, he saw a flash of hope warring with disbelief before she quickly looked away. Again, as the evening wore on, the storm continued its assault on the cabin. Boone added more logs to the fire, keeping it burning bright and warm. Eventually, the boy's coughing eased and his eyes grew heavy. Annalyn helped him curl up on the rug, wrapping him snugly in one of the quilts. She settled beside him, her own quilt pulled tight around her shoulders as exhaustion began to claim her as well. Boone remained in his chair, watching over them as they drifted into sleep. The fire crackled softly, a counterpoint to the wind's fury outside. Here in this room that had known only solitude for so long, something had changed. With two simple words, "Your home," he had opened a door that could never truly be closed. Again, he sat straight and watchful in his chair as the storm raged on. A silent guardian to the unexpected guests who had brought something new into his carefully ordered world. Whether it was trouble or blessing, only time would tell. But for now, in the warmth of the fire's glow, even Boone Carver's hardened heart couldn't help but feel a flutter of something that felt remarkably like hope. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the cabin, Boone stirred from his chair, where he'd kept vigil through the night. His joints protested the movement after so many hours of stillness. Annalyn was already awake, her son still sleeping peacefully by the banked fire. She met Boone's eyes with quiet determination. "I can help with the morning chores," she said softly, mindful of her sleeping child. "It's the least I can do." Boone's first instinct was to refuse, but something in her steady gaze stopped him. Instead, he nodded once and reached for his heavy coat. Annalyn tucked the quilt more securely around her son before following suit. Wrapping herself in her now dry cloak, the morning air bit sharp and clean as they stepped outside. Their boots crunched through fresh snow as they made their way to the barn, where the cattle waited in their stalls. Without a word, Boone began his morning routine, expecting Annalyn to struggle with the heavy work. To his surprise, she moved, with purpose, toward one of the milk cows. Her hands were sure and practiced as she positioned the bucket and began milking with smooth, efficient motions. The steady rhythm of milk hitting the pail filled the comfortable silence between them. "My father kept dairy cows," she offered quietly, not looking up from her work. "Taught me young that idle hands were the devil's playground." Boone grunted in acknowledgement, continuing to fork hay into the feeding troughs. He found himself stealing glances at her as she worked, noting how naturally she moved among the animals. This was no helpless town woman playing at farm work. When they returned to the cabin, Annalyn's son was sitting up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mother immediately set about preparing breakfast, moving around Boone's kitchen as if she'd done it 100 times before. Soon, the smell of frying salt pork and coffee filled the small space. They sat down to eat, the boy more alert now but still quiet, watching everything with solemn eyes. Boone noticed how Annalyn made sure her son's plate was filled before taking any food for herself. The morning light streaming through the window caught the worry lines around her mouth, making her look older than her years. "Ma'am," Boone said, his deep voice gentle despite its roughness. "Reckon it's time you told me what brought you to my door." Annalyn's hand stilled on her cup. She glanced at her son, then back to Boone. "My husband," she began, "worked the Silver Creek mine. It was owned by his family, the Townsends." She paused, drawing a steady breath. "When the shaft collapsed last spring, they said it was his own carelessness that caused it." Boone's jaw tightened. He knew of the Townsends, their wealth, and their reputation for using the law like a weapon. After the funeral, Annalyn continued. "They came with papers. Said my boy was heir property, that they needed him to secure the mining claim." Her voice hardened. "They wanted to take him, raise him as their own. Said I had no right to him anymore." Her son pressed closer to her side, and she wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "I wouldn't sign the papers, couldn't," they threatened, "to have me declared unfit." She met Boone's gaze directly. "So we ran." Boone's expression darkened as he processed her words. The Townsends had connections throughout the territory. Judges, lawmen, politicians. Their reach was long, and their memories longer. Harboring their property as they saw it would make him a target as surely as if he'd stolen their gold. The day passed in shared work, with Annalyn proving her worth at every turn. She mended a tear in Boone's spare shirt without being asked, taught her son his letters using the Bible as a primer, and helped prepare a hearty stew for supper. All the while, Boone watched and considered, weighing the risk against what his conscience demanded. As evening settled in and they gathered around the table once more, Boone finally spoke what had been weighing on his mind. "Staying here paints a target on us both," he said gruffly. "Townsends ain't known for letting things go." Annalyn's face was calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she served the stew. "I know," she replied. "But anywhere else means they'll take my boy." "I can't." She stopped, steadying herself. "I won't let that happen." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Then, to Boone's surprise, Annalyn bowed her head and folded her hands. Her son immediately did the same. "Shall we pray?" she asked softly. Boone stared at them for a long moment. It had been years since he'd said grace over a meal, years since he'd had anyone to share bread with. Awkwardly, he ducked his head and clasped his rough hands together. Annalyn's voice was clear and steady as she spoke. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for kind hearts in hard times. Amen." Her son echoed. "Amen," Boone mumbled, the word feeling foreign on his tongue after so long as they began to eat. Boone couldn't help but notice how right it felt, having others at his table. Even with the shadow of danger hanging over them, there was something peaceful about this moment, something he hadn't known he'd been missing until now. The next morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Boone stood in his barn, checking the leather straps of his wagon harness while frost crackled under his boots. He'd hoped to make the supply run alone, keeping Annalyn and her boy safely hidden at the cabin. But she had other plans. "His cough's getting worse," Annalyn said from the barn doorway, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "We need medicine, Mr. Carver, and I won't hide forever while you risk yourself on our behalf." Boone turned, studying her determined expression. The boy stood beside her, wrapped in one of Boone's old blankets, his small frame shaking with another rattling cough. The sound made Boone's decision for him. "Stay close," he growled, helping them into the wagon. "And if trouble comes, I know when to keep quiet," Annalyn assured him, settling her son between them on the wooden seat. She tucked the blanket tighter around the boy's shoulders. The horses struggled through the deep snow, their hooves breaking through the crusty surface as they pulled the wagon down the mountain trail. Boone handled the reins with practiced ease, but his eyes constantly scanned the white-draped landscape. Every shadow among the pines could hide watching eyes, Annalyn sat straight-backed beside him, her face partially hidden by her shawl. Her son leaned against her, drowsy from the wagons. Gentle rocking. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the horses' labored breathing, and the soft shushing of runners through snow. As they approached town, Boone felt Annalyn tense. The streets were busy despite the cold, and heads turned as they passed. Whispers followed in their wake. "That's Carver, with the mining widow. Townsend's property," I heard. Boone guided the wagon to the hitching post outside the mercantile. "Stay close," he reminded Annalyn as he helped her and the boy down. The store's bell jingled as they entered, drawing every eye in the place. Old Mrs. Henderson behind the counter stopped mid-sentence in her gossip with another customer. The whispers that had followed them outside grew louder within the confined space. Annalyn kept her head high. Though Boone noticed how tightly she held her son's hand, they gathered their supplies efficiently: flour, coffee, sugar, and most importantly, medicine for the boy's cough. Annalyn counted out her meager coins carefully, adding thread and needles to her small pile of purchases. Boone watched her mental calculations, noting how she put back a small piece of candy she'd considered for her son. The store's bell jangled again. Sheriff Clay Dillard stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. His badge caught the winter light streaming through the windows. "Carver," he called out, his voice carrying through the now silent store. A word. Boone exchanged a look with Annalyn, who nodded slightly and drew her son closer to her side. Stepping outside with the sheriff, Boone planted his feet firmly in the snow. His massive frame towered over Dillard's more modest height. "Heard you're harboring certain parties," Dillard said, trying to sound casual despite the tension in his voice. "Parties that belong elsewhere, legally speaking." Boone's silence was as cold as the air between them. "Townsend's are fixing to file papers," Dillard continued, shifting his weight uneasily. "That boy's their bloodkin. They've got rights. Boone's voice was low and dangerous. "To steal a child from his mother." Now, that's not Dillard started, but Boone took one step forward, and the sheriff instinctively retreated. "We done here?" Boone asked, his quiet tone carrying more threat than a shout. Dillard's face flushed red, but he nodded stiffly and walked away. Only then did Boone notice his own hands had curled into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax before returning to the store. Annalyn looked up as he entered, relief visible in her eyes. She had finished her purchases, and the boy was already taking his first dose of medicine, making a face at the bitter taste. Loading the supplies took little time, though Boone felt the weight of watching eyes from every window. He helped Annalyn and her son back into the wagon, noticing how she trembled slightly despite her brave face. The return journey was tenser than the ride in. Boone drove faster, pushing the horses as much as he dared in the deep snow. Every cracking branch in the forest made him reach for the rifle under the seat. "Thank you," Annalyn said softly when they were halfway home, "for standing up to him." "For everything," Boone nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail. But he noticed how she sat straighter after that, as if his silence had given her strength. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, while Boone tended to the horses. Annalyn prepared a simple supper. Her boy's cough already sounded less harsh, thanks to the medicine. After the meal, with her son sleeping peacefully near the fire, Annalyn began to hum softly as she mended clothes by lamplight. Boone recognized the hymn from long ago Sundays. Though he couldn't recall the words, the gentle melody filled the cabin as he worked on fixing a broken chair, his strong hands carefully fitting the pieces. Back together, neither spoke of the day's confrontation or the threats that hung over them. Instead, they shared the quiet evening tasks to wounded souls finding comfort in simple work and unspoken understanding. The broken chair slowly became whole under Boone's patient hands. while Annalyn's needle flashed in the lamplight, mending. What was torn 2 days passed in peaceful rhythm at Boone's cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh snow as Boone demonstrated proper wood-chopping technique to Annalyn. His massive hands engulfed hers as he positioned them correctly on the axe handle. "Keep your feet apart," he instructed, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." He stepped back, watching as Annalyn raised the tool. Her first swing missed the mark, but her second struck true, splitting the log cleanly. Pride flickered across her face as she set up another piece. "Not so different from beating rugs," she said with a small smile. That evening, Annalyn sat by the fire, holding up one of Boone's worn leather gloves. "These need attention before your hands freeze," she observed, reaching for her sewing kit. Boone watched, fascinated, as she worked the heavy needle through the tough leather with practiced skill. "My father was a tanner," she explained, sensing his curiosity taught me leather work before I could walk. Her fingers moved swiftly, making neat stitches that blended with the original seams. The next morning brought similar exchanges of knowledge. Boone showed her how to bank the fire, too, last through cold nights while she taught him the proper way to strain milk. Her son watched it all with bright eyes, asking endless questions that Boone answered with surprising patience. But Sunday's dawn brought tension back to Boone's shoulders as he hitched the wagon. Annalyn appeared in her best dress, faded but clean, her son scrubbed pink and wearing his only good shirt. Boone had even put on a somewhat newer shirt and attempted to tame his wild hair. The small church sat nestled among pine trees at the edge of town, its white-painted boards bright against the snow. As Boone helped Annalyn and her boy down from the wagon, the bell began to toll. Other families climbed the steps, some pausing to stare or whisper behind raised hands. Inside, wooden pews creaked as people shifted away when Boone led Annalyn to a seat. The boy pressed closer to his mother's side, sensing the cold welcome. Sunlight streamed through simple glass windows, but the warmth didn't reach the space around them. Reverend Matthews mounted the pulpit, his stern gaze sweeping the congregation before settling pointedly on Annalyn. His sermon started traditionally enough, but soon took a sharp turn. "Beware, brothers and sisters," he intoned, "of those who would lead the righteous astray, of temptresses who, like Delilah of old, seek to ensnare men of means for their own gain." His eyes bored into Annalyn, who abandoned their proper place and proper people, sowing discord among the faithful. Boone's jaw clenched, his massive frame tensed, ready to rise, to storm out, to protect Annalyn from these barbed words wrapped in scripture. But then he felt it, the gentle pressure of her hand on his sleeve. Looking down, he met her steady gaze. There was pain in her eyes, yes, but also a dignity that refused to be diminished by cruel words. They stayed, enduring the remainder of the sermon. When the final hymn ended, most of the congregation hurried past without meeting their eyes. Only old Widow Carson and the Cooper family stopped to offer welcome, their kindness standing out like stars in a dark sky. "Don't mind them, Widow Carson," said softly to Annalyn. "Some folks forget that Jesus himself kept company with those the righteous rejected." She squeezed Annalyn's hand before shuffling away. The drive home was silent, save for the crunch of snow under the wagon wheels. Annalyn's son dozed against her shoulder, exhausted by the morning's tensions. As the church disappeared behind them, Annalyn finally spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing beside us today, for not letting their judgment drive us out." Boone kept his eyes on the trail, but nodded once, understanding in that moment that her quiet strength had taught him something about dignity and faith. That evening, after a simple supper, Annalyn brought out a worn Bible. "Would you read?" she asked, offering it to Boone. "James has always loved hearing scripture before bed." Boone hesitated, his large hands awkward around the delicate pages. "Been a while," he admitted gruffly. "The 23rd Psalm," Annalyn suggested gently. "Most folks know that one." Boone found the page, his finger tracing the lines as memory stirred. His voice, rough from years of disuse and reading aloud, slowly gained confidence as ancient words filled the cabin. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The familiar verses came back to him, stirring something long buried. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." The boy listened with heavy eyes, curled up in his quilt by the fire. Annalyn's hands stayed busy with mending, but her face softened as Boone's deep voice continued through the psalm. When he finished, James was fast asleep, peaceful despite the day's hurts. Boone closed the Bible carefully, aware that something had shifted within him. The walls he'd built around his heart had developed a crack, letting in warmth he'd forgotten how to feel. He looked at Annalyn in the firelight, saw her quiet strength, her unshakable faith, and felt his own spirit stirred by something he couldn't yet name. The cabin seemed different now, less a fortress against the world and more a sanctuary for healing souls. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, the warmth of shared faith and growing trust kept the cold at bay. The morning stillness shattered with pounding hoofbeats. Boone looked up from mending fence wire to see a rider approaching fast, kicking up snow. The man reined his horse to a sharp halt, scanning the ranch until he spotted Boone. "Message for the property," the rider called out, pulling a folded paper from his coat. He tossed it toward Boone without dismounting, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away before Boone could respond. Boone's weathered hands unfolded the document, his eyes narrowing as he read. Legal words marched across the page in neat rows. But their meaning was clear enough: the mining family had found a way to strike. The paper declared Annalyn's son an indentured apprentice to the mine, complete with Sheriff Dillard's flourishing signature at the bottom. Rage built in Boone's chest like a gathering storm. He strode to the barn, his long legs eating up the distance. Within minutes, he had saddled his horse and was thundering toward town. The cursed paper crumpled in his fist. The sheriff's office sat quiet in the late morning sun. Boone's spurs rang against the wooden sidewalk as he approached. Inside, Sheriff Dillard lounged behind his desk, boots propped up, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He didn't seem surprised when Boone burst in. Boone slammed the paper onto the desk, sending the coffee cup rattling. "What kind of law is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Dillard slowly lowered his boots to the floor. "Now, Boone," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness, "everything there is proper and legal. Boy's got mining blood, family, has rights to his upbringing." Rights? Boone's massive frame seemed to fill the small office. "You mean they paid you to write up this load of horse apples? Watch yourself," Dillard warned, though he remained seated. "Law's the law, whether you like it or not. That paper gives them full authority to collect the boy." Boone leaned forward, planting both hands on the desk. "You listen good?" he growled. "Any man sets foot on my ranch, aiming to take that child, answers to me. Law or no law." "That sounds mighty close to threatening an officer," Dillard said, but his voice wavered slightly. "Not threatening." Boone straightened to his full height, promising. He turned and strode out, leaving the crumpled paper behind. The ride home gave his anger time to cool, but another emotion crept in to replace it: guilt. His protection might bring more trouble down on Annalyn and her boy. The mining family wouldn't stop with paper threats. Back at the ranch, he found Annalyn and James in the cabin. The boy sat close to his mother on their bed, his small face pinched with worry. Annalyn was telling him a story, her voice warm and steady despite the fear Boone could see in her eyes. "When I was just your age," she said, stroking James's hair, My PA took me fishing at the creek behind our house. The other children said there weren't any fish worth catching there, but PA knew better. He taught me patience, showed me how to be still and wait. She smiled at a memory. First fish I caught was barely bigger than my hand, but Pa acted like I'd landed a whale. Said it wasn't the size that mattered, it was knowing that good things come to those who stay faithful and true. James leaned into her embrace, some of his tension easing. Boone watched from the doorway, struck by how she faced uncertainty with such grace. When she noticed him, a silent understanding passed between them. That evening, as they sat down to supper, Boone finally spoke about his ride to town. He described the sheriff's dismissal of justice, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "Been ranching here 15 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thought I knew how things worked. But seeing how money bends the law like a willow branch," he shook his head. "Makes me wonder what's right anymore." Annalyn was quiet. For a moment, stirring her stew. "My father used to say that true justice flows from higher ground than any courthouse," she said softly. "Like a spring that can't be bought or dammed up by men's greed. Higher ground won't stop them coming," Boone warned. "No," she agreed, reaching across the table to touch his hand, "but it gives us strength to stand. It's not just for land or paper for James's right to grow up free and dignified." Boone looked at their joined hands, then at James quietly eating his supper. Something shifted in his chest, a determination deeper than anger taking root. This wasn't just about defying the mining family anymore. It was about protecting the fragile hope growing in his home, about standing for what was right even when the law stood wrong. "We'll need that strength," he said finally, turning his hand to clasp hers properly. "All of us." James looked up from his bowl, glancing between them. Despite his youth, he seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Annalyn smiled at her son, then at Boone, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but also with resolve. They finished their meal in companionable silence. Three people bound together by more than circumstance, bound by a shared commitment to face whatever came next. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of another storm, but inside the cabin, determination burned stronger than any winter cold. Heavy snow blanketed the Colorado highlands, turning Boone's ranch into an island of warmth. Amid the frozen wilderness, the drifts grew so deep that venturing to town became impossible, but inside the cabin, a different kind of change was taking place. Annalyn moved through her days with quiet purpose, establishing routines that transformed the bare cabin into something closer to a home. She rose before dawn to help Boone with the morning chores, her capable hands matching his as they fed livestock and repaired winter damage. The boy, James, followed them like a shadow, eager to help despite his small size. "The bucket's steady now," Annalyn instructed one morning, showing James how to collect eggs from beneath irritable hens. "That's it, gentle hands." Boone watched from the barn doorway, a half-smile touching his lips. He'd forgotten how a child's presence could brighten even the coldest days as evening fell each day. They gathered around the wooden table Boone had built years ago. Annalyn insisted on teaching him his letters, spreading scraps of paper across the worn surface. Her finger guided his rough hand, helping him trace out familiar verses from her mother's Bible. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read slowly, watching Boone copy each word with intense concentration. "See how the H curves here?" Boone's massive hands, more accustomed to rope and reins, moved carefully across the paper. His face flushed with effort and something like shame. "Never had much schooling," he admitted gruffly. "You're learning now," Annalyn said softly. "That's what matters." By lamplight, she shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, of her Methodist family, and the simple faith that sustained them. Boone found himself speaking to, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. he told of coming west. Alone at 16, of building his ranch from nothing but determination and hard work. One evening, while James played with wooden animals Boone had carved, Annalyn presented a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Boone asked, suspicious of gifts. "Open it," she urged, her eyes bright with anticipation. Inside lay a shirt, sturdy and well-made, crafted from fabric she'd saved from her mending work. The stitches were tiny and even, the collar perfectly shaped to his broad neck. Boone ran his fingers over the careful seams, unable to speak. "You needed a new one," Annalyn said simply, understanding his silence. "I had the time." Boone nodded, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't express. He'd lived so long without anyone to care about such things, the fit of a shirt, the comfort of a home. James looked up from his play, grinning. "Mama makes the best shirts," he declared proudly. His laughter, once rare, now filled the cabin regularly. A sound that seemed to chase away the winter shadows. But peace never lasts unchallenged. One evening, as dusk painted the snow purple, the crack of gunfire split the air. Shots whistled past the corral, sending cattle into a panicked chorus of bellowing. Boone grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. "Stay inside," he ordered Annalyn, who clutched James close. Through the gathering darkness, Boone made out 5 riders, their horses stamping in the snow. They sat just beyond clear shooting range, rifles gleaming. "That's close enough." Boone's voice boomed across the yard. He stood his full height on the porch, rifle ready, a giant silhouette against the lamplit windows. The lead rider spurred his horse forward a few steps. "Just delivering a message. Carver," he called, voice dripping with false friendliness. "Mining company don't take kindly to folk harboring their property." "Boy ain't property," Boone growled. "Neither's his mother. Clear out before I forget my manners." Laughter rippled through the group, ugly and sharp. "We'll be back when the weather breaks," the leader promised. "Better rethink your position for then." They wheeled their horses around, vanishing into the darkness like wolves slinking away from a fire. But their threat lingered, heavy as the snow clouds above. Boone returned inside to find Annalyn comforting James, who trembled slightly but didn't cry. She looked up at Boone with worry in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Boone said, setting his rifle aside, "bringing this danger down on you." He began checking the cabin's defenses, testing the door's strength. "I'll reinforce this come morning." "Don't apologize," Annalyn interrupted firmly. She stood, James still in her arms. "Your kindness saved us that first night and every night since. We'd have frozen in that storm if you'd turned us away." "Kindness might get us all killed," Boone muttered, but his hands gentled as he stroked James's hair. "Or it might save us." All Annalyn countered. She touched Boone's arm, the gesture familiar now. "We're stronger together than alone. You've shown us that." James nodded solemnly. "You keep us safe," he said with a child's simple faith. Boone looked at them both, the woman who'd brought warmth back to his life, the boy who'd awakened something protective in his soul. Whatever came next, they faced it as a family now. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with fierce determination. They spent that evening closer than usual, sharing stories and scripture verses until James dozed off. The boy slept peacefully despite the earlier violence, secure in their presence. Boone and Annalyn sat in comfortable silence, watching the fires dance across his innocent face. Outside, wind howled through fresh snow, but inside their besieged sanctuary, bonds of love and trust grew stronger than any winter storm or human threat could challenge. After 3 days of relentless snow, the sky finally cleared, revealing a pristine white landscape beneath a brilliant blue dome. The temperature remained bitter, but the break in weather meant Boone's cattle needed tending. Their usual watering holes would be frozen solid. "I reckon it'll take most of the morning," Boone said over breakfast, watching Annalyn pour steaming coffee into his cup. "The herds likely scattered some during the storm." Annalyn nodded, adding another log to the cast iron stove. "We'll keep." "The home fire's burning," she assured him, one hand resting on her son's shoulder. "James here is getting right skilled at feeding the flames, aren't you?" The boy beamed with pride. "I know just how Papa Boone likes it, now hot enough to chase the cold clear out." Boone's heart caught at the boy's words. He hadn't noticed when James had started calling him that, but it filled an empty place inside him he'd thought long dead. Hiding his emotion behind his coffee cup, he pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed, checking his rifle before slinging it across his back. "Don't open it for anyone but me." The morning air bit at his face as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the barn. His breath frosted in thick clouds while he saddled his horse and gathered his gear. The work ahead would be hard, but necessary. Cattle were the lifeblood of his ranch. Hours passed as Boone rode the boundaries of his land, gathering scattered cattle and breaking ice at the creek. The sun climbed high, offering little warmth, but welcome light. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin, to Annalyn's quiet strength and James's trusting eyes. He'd lived alone so long, convinced solitude was his lot. Now, the sound of his horse's hooves crunching through snow accompanied him on the return journey. As he approached the barn, something caught his eye, piece of paper fluttering against the wooden door. His stomach tightened as he dismounted and pulled it free. The message was brief but clear. "Give up the widow and the boy, or lose everything." Boone's hands shook, not from cold, but from rage. The threat was plain as day, and he knew the mining family had resources to back it up. They could burn him out, stampede his cattle, or worse. But the thought of surrendering Annalyn and James to their cruel demands made his blood boil. He led his horse into the barn, completed his chores with mechanical precision, then headed for the cabin. Inside, warmth and the smell of baking bread greeted him. James ran to hug his legs while Annalyn stirred something fragrant on the stove. Without a word, Boone crossed to the stove and fed the threatening note into the flames. He watched it curl and blacken, taking its poison with it. "Boone?" Annalyn's voice was soft with concern. "What was that?" "Nothing worth keeping," he answered gruffly, but his next actions betrayed his worry. He retrieved his spare rifle from its rack, checking. It was clean and ready. "Come here. There's something you need to learn." Annalyn's eyes widened as he held out the weapon. "I don't." "It's not for fighting," Boone explained, his voice gentler now. "It's for protection. Like a shepherd's staff keeps the wolves at bay." Slowly, he showed her how to load the rifle, how to check the action, how to sight along the barrel. Her hands trembled slightly, but she paid careful attention. "I pray I'll never need this knowledge," she said firmly, stepping back once the lesson was done. "I won't raise steel against another soul unless there's no other choice. The good book teaches us to overcome evil with good." Boone nodded, respecting her conviction even as he worried it might prove dangerous. "Sometimes good needs a helping hand," he said quietly, "but I hope you're right." The evening settled around them like a heavy blanket. James played with his wooden animals near the fire, while Annalyn mended and Boone cleaned his tools. The comfortable silence between them grew deeper, more meaningful, until Boone found himself speaking words he'd never meant to share. "Used to pray every night," he admitted, staring into the flames. "When I first came west, prayed for a wife, for children to fill this cabin with laughter." His voice roughened with old pain. "After years of silence, I figured God's answer was no. Stopped asking. Stopped believing, truth be told." Annalyn's hands stilled in her lap. She studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the hard exterior to the wounded soul beneath. Sometimes his answers take longer than we expect, she said softly. Sometimes the path to them winds through dark valleys before reaching sunshine. Boone turned to look at her, then really look at her. The firelight caught golden highlights in her hair, softened the worry lines around her eyes. He saw strength there, and grace, and something that made his heart beat faster. Was it possible God had heard those long-ago prayers after all? James yawned widely, breaking the moment. Annalyn smiled and gathered him up, settling him on the pallet near the fire where they slept. The boy's eyes drifted closed almost immediately. Secure in their presence, Boone watched them both, the widow who'd brought life back to his home, the child who called him Papa. Threat or no threat, he knew he'd die before letting harm come to them, but Annalyn's words about faith stirred something deeper than mere protection. They sat together in the firelight, neither speaking but both aware of the changing current between them. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars glittering like ice above the snow-covered land. Inside, warmth and hope flowered in the silence. Fragile as spring's first bloom, but just as determined to grow. Snow crunched beneath Annalyn's boots as she gathered eggs. From the henhouse early one December morning, the air held that special stillness that came before Christmas, making her think of celebrations past. Inside the cabin, she found Boone teaching James how to whittle a small piece of wood, their heads bent together in concentration. "I've been thinking," she said, setting down her basket. "Christmas is coming next week. Maybe we could visit town for the celebrations." Boone's hands stilled on the whittling knife. "I ain't exactly safe," he muttered. But James's face had already lit up like a lantern. "Oh, please, Papa Boone." The boy bounced in his seat. "I want to see the Christmas tree at church. Mama says they put real candles on it." Annalyn watched Boone's resistance crumble under the weight of James's enthusiasm. The big rancher tried to maintain his stern expression, but his eyes softened as the boy described all the Christmas wonders he remembered from years past. "Reckon we could manage one afternoon," Boone finally conceded, unable to disappoint the child. "But we stay together, you hear?" The next day found them in Boone's wagon, extra blankets wrapped around their legs against the cold. James sat between them, pointing at everything with wonder, from frost-covered trees to smoke curling from chimneys in town. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow as they approached the bustling main street. Miller's General Store had pine garlands strung across its front, and the smell of cinnamon and clove drifted from the bakery next door. Several townsfolk paused their errands to stare as Boone helped Annalyn and James down from the wagon. Some faces showed open hostility, while others quickly looked away. But then old Mrs. Peterson, leaving the store with her shopping, stopped to smile at James. "My, ain't you grown since I saw you last? Merry Christmas to you, child." Her kind words seemed to break a spell, and a few other friendly faces emerged from the crowd. Inside Miller's store, warm lights spilled across wooden floors and shelves, stocked with Christmas goods. Mr. Miller himself stood behind the counter, his round face brightening when he saw James. "Well now, what have we here?" The shopkeeper came around the counter while Annalyn gathered necessary supplies. He knelt beside James, speaking in a stage whisper. "I believe I might have something special for good boys at Christmas time." From beneath the counter he produced a small wooden horse painted bright red and green. "Made this myself," he said, pressing it into James's wondering hands. Then, standing closer to Annalyn, he added quietly, "You're doing right by your boy, Mrs. Townsend. Don't let anyone tell you different." Tears pricked at Annalyn's eyes as she thanked him. Across the store, Boone watched the exchange, his large frame blocking the window where several unfriendly faces peered in. As evening approached, lamplight began glowing from the white-painted church on the hill. Bells rang out, calling people to the Christmas gathering. Annalyn smoothed her best dress, carefully pressed that morning, and looked uncertainly at Boone. "We don't have to stay long," she offered, knowing how he disliked crowds. But Boone just adjusted his clean shirt collar and nodded toward the church. "Boy ought to see the tree," he said simply. Inside, candles flickered in windows and along the walls. A tall pine tree stood near the altar, decorated with paper chains, dried orange slices, and careful rows of small candles. James gasped in delight, clutching his new wooden horse. They found seats near the back, but not everyone turned away this time. The baker's wife smiled and nodded. The blacksmith touched his hat respectfully to Boone. When the singing started, Annalyn felt some of her tension ease. During Silent Night, her favorite hymn, she felt Boone's rough hand brush against hers. On the wooden pew, without looking, she let her fingers rest briefly against his. A touch light as a snowflake, but warm as summer sun. In that moment, with James between them and candlelight painting everything golden, they felt like a real family. The feeling lingered as they left the church, James chattering excitedly about the tree and the songs. But Boone's expression darkened as they approached the wagon. His eyes scanned the shadowy street, settling on distant riders at the edge of town. They sat motionless on their horses, watching. Boone's jaw hardened as he helped Annalyn and James into the wagon. He took the long way home, checking frequently to ensure they weren't followed. The boy fell asleep against Annalyn's shoulder, still clutching his wooden horse. Later that night, with James tucked into his bed near the fire, Annalyn sat in her rocking chair, watching the flames dance. "Thank you," she said softly to Boone. "For today, for everything." "Ain't nothing," he muttered, but his eyes were gentle in the firelight. "It's everything," Annalyn insisted. Today was the first time since. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The first time since becoming a widow that I felt truly seen. Not as someone's property or problem, but as part of a family." Boone didn't speak, but he moved his chair closer to hers. Together they watched the fire, while outside their cabin, snow began to fall again, soft and silent as prayer. A week after their Christmas visit to town, winter's grip tightened mercilessly around the cabin. The change came sudden as lightning. One moment James was helping Annalyn feed the chickens. The next, he swayed like a sapling in strong wind. "Mama," his small voice trembled. "I don't feel right." Annalyn caught him as his knees buckled. His skin burned against her palm when she touched his forehead. Fear clawed at her throat as she carried him inside, his slight frame shivering violently against her chest. "Boone," she called, struggling to keep her voice steady. The rancher appeared from the barn, his expression darkening at the sight of James's flushed face. Inside, Annalyn laid James on his bed near the fire. The boy's teeth chattered despite the heat rolling from the hearth. His eyes had taken on a glassy sheen that made Annalyn's heart constrict. "He needs the doctor," she said, wringing out a cool cloth to lay across his forehead. James whimpered at the touch, turning his face into the pillow. Boone didn't hesitate. "I'll ride now," he said, already reaching for his heavy coat. "Keep him warm." Through the cabin's window, Annalyn watched Boone's broad figure disappear into the gathering dusk, his horse's hooves kicking up snow. She turned back to James, whose breathing had grown labored. "Lord," she whispered, smoothing back his damp hair, "please spare my boy. Please." The hours crawled by like wounded things. Annalyn sang hymns softly, changed the cool cloths, and tried to coax water between James's cracked lips. The boy drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes calling out for people who weren't there. "Papa," he cried once, his voice thin as paper. "Papa, where are you?" Annalyn's tears fell onto the quilt as she held his burning hand. "Mama's here, sweetheart. Mama's right here." The cabin door finally burst open, bringing a blast of cold air and Boone's towering form. But he was alone. The look in his eyes told Annalyn everything before he spoke. "Doctor won't come," he growled, his fists clenched at his sides. "Said he had orders. From them mining folks." The last words came out like poison. "Orders." Annalyn's voice broke. "Orders to let a child suffer." Boone's face twisted with helpless rage. He slammed his palm against the wall, making the windows rattle. "Ain't right," he muttered. "Ain't Christian nor human." James stirred at the noise, his eyes rolling beneath half-closed lids. The sight of him seemed to drain the anger from Boone, leaving something raw and aching in its place. Night settled heavy around the cabin. James's fever climbed higher until heat radiated from his small body like a forge. His breathing grew more labored with each passing hour. "No, no, no," Annalyn pleaded, pressing her forehead against his burning hand. "Please, Lord, not my boy, not my James." Her shoulders shook with sobs she could no longer contain. Boone stood frozen by the fire, watching mother and child with haunted eyes. Then, slowly, as if moving through deep water, he lowered his massive frame to kneel beside Annalyn. "Lord," he began, his voice rough and uncertain. "Been a long time since I asked you for anything. Figured you'd turned your back on me, same as I did you." He paused, swallowing hard. "But this boy ain't done nothing wrong. He ain't deserving of punishment for my sins." Annalyn lifted her tear-stained face, watching as Boone's proud shoulders trembled. "If you're still listening," his booming voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't take him, please. Take me instead, if you need someone, but let this child live." James stirred again, his cracked lips moving. "Papa," he called weakly. "Papa Boone." Boone's breath caught in his throat. He reached out with shaking hands to take James's small fingers in his own. "I'm here, son," he said hoarsely. "I'm right here, and I ain't letting you go. You hear me? I ain't letting you slip away." For a moment, the only sound was the crackling fire and James's labored breathing. Then Boone stood abruptly, his face set with determination. "Keep him cool as you can," he told Annalyn, already reaching for his coat. "I'm riding out." "Where?" Annalyn asked, watching him check his pistol and tuck extra ammunition into his belt. "There's an Indian medicine woman, lives 3 ridges over," he said, pulling on his gloves. "Townfolk won't go to her, but I've seen her heal worse than this. If she come, she might be our only hope. But the storm." Annalyn gestured to the window where snow swirled in the darkness. "Don't matter," Boone said firmly. "I'll find her." He paused at the door, looking back at James's still form and Annalyn's worried face. Something softened in his expression. "Keep praying," he said quietly. "Reckon God might listen to you better than me." The cabin door opened and closed. Through the frost-covered window, Annalyn watched Boone saddle his horse by lantern light. His movements quick and sure despite the bitter cold. The night swallowed him as he rode out, leaving only the whisper of wind and the sound of James's troubled breathing. Annalyn turned back to her son, taking his hot hand in hers. "Hold on, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." Outside, the midnight hour approached, marked by the hollow cry of a distant coyote. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone rider pushed his horse through deepening snow, racing against time and nature itself, carrying desperate hope through the wild winter. Night moonlight painted the snow-laden landscape in shades of silver and shadow as Boone urged his horse through the drifts. The frozen air burned his lungs with each breath, but he pressed on, following a trail only memory could guide him through. His mount's hooves punched through the crusty surface, sending up plumes of powder that sparkled in the stark light. The path toward the Ute encampment twisted through narrow valleys he hadn't traveled in years. Each familiar landmark stirred memories he'd rather forget. There, beneath that towering pine, he'd shared meat and stories with Walking Bear, the old scout who'd saved him from a mountain lion's claws. And there, by that stream, now frozen silent, they'd argued bitterly over grazing rights until pride drove them apart. "Should have listened better," Boone muttered, his words carried away by the wind. His horse nickered in response, steam rising from its flanks. The moon tracked across the sky as Boone guided his mount higher into the hills. Time pressed against him like a physical weight. Every moment spent breaking trail was another moment James struggled for breath back in the cabin. The thought spurred him to push harder, though his legs had gone numb with cold. Near the crest of the third ridge, wolf howls echoed through the darkness. Boone's horse danced nervously, but he steadied it with a firm hand. "Easy now," he murmured. "We're almost there." The Ute encampment appeared like a dream through the swirling snow, a collection of lodges nestled in a protected hollow. Smoke rose from central fires, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Boone's approach didn't go unnoticed. Two riders materialized from the shadows, rifles gleaming. "Who comes?" The challenge came in English, sharp as an arrow. Boone raised his hands slowly. "Boone Carver," he called out. "Seeking medicine woman Sarah." The guards exchanged words in their own tongue. One peeled away, vanishing into the camp while the other kept watch. Boone waited, fighting the urge to shift in his frozen saddle. Every minute felt like an hour. Footsteps crunched in the snow. An elderly woman emerged from between the lodges, her silver hair catching the moonlight. She wore a thick wool blanket over her dress, moving with the steady grace Boone remembered. "Sarah," he said, inclining his head respectfully. She studied him with eyes that had seen nearly 8 decades of winters. "Boone Carver," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of their shared past. "Many moons since you turned your back on us." Shame burned in his chest despite the cold. "I was wrong," he admitted, too proud to see it then. "But I'm not here for myself. No." One gray eyebrow lifted. "A boy lies dying in my cabin. Fever burns through him like wildfire. Town doctor won't come. Politics and money speaking louder than mercy." The words tumbled out, urgent and raw. "I remember how you healed Running Cloud's son when the fever took him. Please, his mother has nowhere else to turn." Sarah's gaze never wavered. "You ride through dangerous night, risk wolves and cold to help another's child." "Yes, and you come to people you once spurned, asking aid." "Yes." Boone's voice roughened. "I'll pay any price you name." Sarah turned to speak quietly with one of the guards. After a moment, she faced Boone again. "This is the Boone I once knew, the one who would lay down his life for others before pride poisoned his heart." Hope flickered in Boone's chest as she continued. "I will come, but not for payment. I come because a child suffers, and because perhaps the proud man has remembered how to bend like the willow instead of standing rigid like the oak." She disappeared briefly into her lodge, emerging with a leather bag of medicines. One of the younger men helped her mount a sturdy pony, and soon they were moving through the darkness together. Sarah setting a careful but determined pace. The return journey seemed twice as long. The moon had set, leaving only starlight to guide them. Sarah spoke little, conserving her energy for the trail, but her presence beside him felt like a bridge being rebuilt over a deep canyon of years. Dawn was just touching the eastern sky when they finally reached Boone's cabin. Smoke rose strong from the chimney. Annalyn had kept the fire well fed. Boone's heart clenched at the thought of her long vigil. The door flew open at the sound of their approach. Annalyn stood in the doorway, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Relief flooded her features at the sight of Sarah. "Thank God," she breathed, then swayed slightly. Boone crossed the space in 2 long strides. steadying her with a gentle hand. "How is he?" "Burning up," Annalyn whispered. "Been calling. For you." Sarah moved past them with purpose, going straight to James's bedside. She laid one weathered hand on his forehead, closing her eyes briefly. "Fetch fresh snow," she instructed, already opening her medicine bag. "Clean buckets. And your largest cooking pot." Boone and Annalyn rushed to comply. While they gathered supplies, Sarah pulled various herbs and roots from her bag, measuring with practiced eyes. She crushed some into powder, set others aside whole, and placed several dark leaves into the pot as Annalyn added snow to melt. "Watch carefully," Sarah told them as she worked. "These medicines I will show you. They are gifts from the earth itself. The steam will help him breathe. The tea will cool his blood." In a blur of activity, Sarah directed them like a general commanding troops, Boone crushing herbs with a stone mortar, Annalyn helping to hold James up while they spooned medicine between his lips. The boy remained lost in fever dreams, but his breathing seemed to ease as aromatic steam filled the cabin. Near midday, Sarah stood watching James sleep, his chest rising and falling more regularly. "The worst has passed," she announced quietly. "But he will need care for several days. I will show you how to prepare the medicines." Annalyn sagged with relief, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How can we ever repay you?" Sarah's eyes crinkled at the corners. "By remembering that healing comes in many forms. Sometimes the body, sometimes the heart." She glanced at Boone. "Sometimes old friendships." Boone met her gaze, seeing decades of wisdom there. "I reckon I've learned that lesson late," he said. "Roughly, but I've learned it true." Sarah nodded, satisfied. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, sending rays of light dancing across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and James slept peacefully at last, while three unlikely allies watched over him with grateful hearts. Steam rose from the kettle as Sarah showed Kaylin how to measure the willow bark. Not too much, she cautioned, her weathered hands guiding the younger woman's movements. The medicine must be strong enough to heal, but gentle enough not to harm. Through the cabin's windows, the moon cast silver light across the floorboards. James tossed restlessly on his bed, his small face flushed with fever. Boone stood nearby, his massive frame seeming to fill the corner as he watched their work with worried eyes. "More water," Sarah instructed, and Boone moved instantly, taking the bucket outside to fill it with fresh snow. The door's hinges creaked. In the stillness of night, letting in a burst of cold air that made the lantern flames dance, Annalyn wrung out a cloth in cool water, placing it on her son's forehead. Her voice, though tired, carried clearly as she sang softly, "Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Sarah nodded approvingly as she crushed herbs with practiced movements. "Songs of faith can be medicine too," she said. "They strengthen the spirit while we tend the body." The hours crept by like molasses in winter. Boone made countless trips for water, his boots leaving wet patches on the floor that dried and were renewed again. Each time he returned, his eyes went straight to James, searching for any sign of improvement. Near midnight, the boy's fever peaked. His small body shook with chills despite the warm blankets, and he called out in delirium for his father. Annalyn's face crumpled at the sound, but she kept singing, her voice breaking only slightly. "Through many dangers, toils and snares have already come." Boone stepped outside briefly, unable to bear the helplessness any longer. The night sky spread, vast and clear above him, stars burning like distant campfires in the darkness. He removed his hat and for the first time in years prayed without shame or reservation. "Lord," he whispered roughly, "you brought them to my door. Don't let that boy slip away now, please." Inside, Sarah was adding more herbs to the steaming kettle. The pungent smell of medicine filled the cabin, mixing with wood smoke and melting snow. Annalyn hadn't left James's side for hours, her fingers gentle as she bathed his face and neck. With cool cloths dot slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. Sweat beaded on James's forehead, not the dry heat of fever, but the healthy moisture of a body cooling itself naturally. His breathing grew deeper, more regular. Sarah touched his chest and nodded, satisfaction crossing her lined face. "The tide turns," she said simply. Annalyn's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Boone, returning from another water run, set the bucket down with a thud when he saw their expressions. "He's going to be all right." His voice was hardly more than a whisper. Sarah held up one hand in caution. "Recovery will not be swift," she warned. "The body must rebuild its strength slowly, like a tree growing new leaves after winter." "But yes, he will live." The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the eastern sky when James finally fell into natural sleep. His breathing was easy now, his face peaceful. Annalyn, exhausted beyond measure, swayed where she sat. Boone moved. Without thinking, catching her as she started to fall. She turned in his arms, pressing her face against his chest, and began to cry. Soft, racking sobs of relief and gratitude. "I remember," she said between tears, "that night in the storm, when I knocked on your door. I had nothing left but prayer. I have nowhere else to go. I told you." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears and wonder. "God heard me. He led us here, to you." Boone's throat worked, but no words came. The trust in her gaze undid him completely. He could only hold her, his own eyes burning as the morning light grew stronger outside. Sarah watched them with knowing eyes as she gathered her medicines. "The boy will need special tea for several days," she instructed, setting aside carefully. Wrapped packages of herbs. 3 times daily, brewed fresh each time. Annalyn pulled away from Boone reluctantly, wiping her eyes. "How can we ever repay you?" she asked the healer. "Feed me breakfast," Sarah replied with a small smile. "That will be thanks enough for now." Annalyn hurried to the stove, pulling out cornbread she'd baked the day before and setting a pan to heat. For eggs, Boone cleared his throat roughly. "There's more than breakfast owed here," he said. "You didn't just save the boy, you taught us how to help him. Showed us medicines we didn't know. That's a debt I aim to repay proper, when I can." Sarah settled at the table, accepting a cup of coffee from Annalyn. "Perhaps you already have," she said cryptically. "You came asking help, not demanding it. You set aside pride for love." She glanced at Annalyn, then back to Boone. "Sometimes the greatest debts are paid by changing our hearts." Sunlight streamed through the windows now, catching dust motes in golden beams. James slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of healing. Annalyn moved between stove and table, serving breakfast with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion, but joy too. Boone remained standing, his big frame somehow softer in the morning light. He watched Annalyn, watched James, watched this unlikely family that had grown around him like wild roses, taking root in rocky soil. Something in his chest felt too full for words, so he simply bowed his head in silence. Gratitude for answered prayers and second chances. Word spread through town like wildfire about James's brush with death. The story grew with each telling. How Boone Carver had ridden through the night storm to fetch the Ute healer. How they'd worked together to save the mining widow's son when the town doctor had turned them away. Martha Wilson was the first to arrive at the ranch, her wagon loaded with fresh bread and stew. For the boy's strength, she said simply, pressing the covered dishes into Annalyn's hands. Behind her, Thomas Baker trudged through the snow with an armload of split firewood. "Figured you might be running low," he mumbled, not meeting Boone's eyes directly. "What with all the night watches and such?" Throughout the day, more neighbors appeared, Some brought food, others supplies. Few spoke much, but their presence said what words couldn't. Even those who had turned away at church now nodded in greeting, shame and sympathy mixing in their expressions. Sarah, the Ute healer, remained close by, checking on James's recovery each morning. Her presence seemed to bridge old divisions as townspeople who had never spoken to the Ute before found themselves sharing coffee at Boone's table, united in concern for the boy. The peaceful morning shattered 3 days later. Hoofbeats thundered up the road for deputies, led by Sheriff Dillard himself, their badges glinting in the winter sun. They carried papers in hand and determination in their stance. Boone stood at his gate, somehow seeming taller than his usual towering height. Behind him, neighbors who had been visiting formed a line. Thomas Baker, John Wilson, and others who had brought food and wood in recent days. Sarah stood among them, her face calm but resolute. "That's far enough." Boone's voice rolled like thunder across the yard. Sheriff Dillard reined his horse to a stop, trying to mask his surprise at the show of support. "We have legal documents declaring the boy ward of the mining company," he announced, waving the papers. "Stand aside, Carver. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." "No." Boone's response was simple but immovable as the mountains. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, hands hovering near their guns. But before tension could spark into violence, Martha Wilson's voice rang out from the crowd. "Shame on you, Clay Dillard." She stepped forward, her usually gentle face fierce with maternal fury. "That boy nearly died while your precious doctor refused to help. Where was your legal authority then?" Others joined in, their voices rising in anger and accusation. "You'd tear a child from his mother's arms. That mining family's money won't wash this sin clean. The boy belongs with his mama." The deputies looked increasingly uncertain, several refusing to meet the condemning eyes of their neighbors. Sheriff Dillard's face reddened as he realized the tide of town opinion had turned against him. "The law," he began weakly. "The law ain't always right," Thomas Baker cut in. "And it sure ain't right today." Sarah stepped forward, her quiet dignity commanding attention. "This boy lives because his mother and this man chose love over pride," she said. "Your papers cannot match the strength of such bonds." Sheriff Dillard looked from face to face, finding no allies among the gathered crowd. His authority crumbled in the face of community solidarity. With a sharp gesture to his deputies, he wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over, Carver," he called over his shoulder. But the threat sounded hollow. The gathered neighbors watched until the deputies disappeared down the road. Then, as if nothing unusual had happened, they returned to their tasks, stacking wood, sharing coffee, checking on James, who slept peacefully inside. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. The preacher stood awkwardly at the door, hat in hands, his face drawn with regret. "I've come to apologize," he said simply. "My words that Sunday, they were cruel and wrong. I let others' influence cloud my judgment of what was right in God's eyes." Annalyn invited him in with grace that humbled him further. They gathered around the hearth, Boone, Annalyn, the preacher, and James, who was finally strong enough to sit up in his chair. The preacher's prayer was heartfelt. "Lord, forgive us, who were blind to your work here. Thank you for showing us that family is born not just of blood, but of love and choice and faith. Bless this home and these your children. Amen." When he left, Annalyn stood at the window, watching the sun set behind snow-covered peaks. "You stood against the law itself today," she said softly to Boone. For us, Boone moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring as an oak. "Family don't run," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. James dozed in his chair, his color healthy again, chest rising and falling steadily. Sarah's medicines and Annalyn's constant care had worked their healing. But something else had been healed too, the town's heart, Boone's solitude. The broken places in all of them. Outside, more snow began to fall, soft and gentle. But inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like spring flowers pushing through winter. Earth. The family that had begun with a desperate knock on a stormy night was now rooted deep, strengthened by trial, and finally accepted by the community that had once shunned them. The harsh Colorado winter loosened its grip gradually, like a bear awakening from hibernation. Patches of bare earth emerged through melting snow, and the morning air carried hints of spring's promise. The changing season brought new life to Boone Carver's ranch and to the people who called it home. Boone and Annalyn worked side by side in the warming soil, their movements falling into natural rhythm. Her skilled hands planted vegetable seeds in neat rows while he turned the earth, his massive shoulders less tense than in months past. The ground that had been frozen now welcomed their care. Dark soil, rich with possibility. "Reckon we'll have enough tomatoes to feed half the county," Boone said, watching Annalyn carefully space the tiny seeds. She smiled up at him, wisps of hair escaping her bonnet. "Good thing, too. Your appetite could feed half the county all on its own." James, fully recovered from his winter illness, darted between them with handful after handful of seeds, his laughter bright as sunshine. The boy had flourished in recent weeks, his cheeks filled out and pink with health. Every morning found him at the barn, helping Boone feed the new calves with a dedication that made both adults hide proud smiles. "Careful there, son," Boone called as James nearly tripped over his own eager feet. The word son fell from his lips naturally now, as if it had always belonged there. In the afternoons, Boone worked on his surprise. Hidden in the barn, he carefully shaped wooden planks, measuring twice and cutting once, just as his father had taught him. The porch swing had lived in his mind for years, a simple dream he'd packed away with other hopes of family. Now, his hands remembered the craft, and the wood seemed to know its purpose. Sundays brought new purpose to them all. The church, once a place of judgment, transformed into a schoolroom after services. Annalyn stood before a dozen children, teaching letters and numbers with patient grace. The preacher himself had suggested it, perhaps as continued penance for his earlier harsh words. "A is for apple." Young voices chorused while proud parents watched from doorways. Even children who once whispered about the mining widow now begged to attend her. Lessons, town attitudes had shifted like spring winds changing direction. Where there had been suspicion, now grew respect. Women at the general store spoke warmly of how the once fierce Boone Carver now carried James on his shoulders, pointing out constellations on clear nights. Men nodded approvingly at the way he and Annalyn worked as one, turning his bachelor's ranch into a thriving family home. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in spring pastels, Boone finally finished the porch swing. He hung it carefully, testing each rope, then called Annalyn outside. She gasped softly at the sight, the smooth sanded wood gleaming with fresh oil, the gentle sway promising peaceful evenings to come. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her hand along the curved back. Boone cleared his throat, suddenly nervous as a schoolboy. "Been meaning to build one for years," he said. "Never seemed right before. This place was too quiet, too empty." He paused, gathering courage. "With you here, it's different. Everything's different." Annalyn turned to face him, her eyes soft with understanding. "This place was hollow too long." Boone continued, his voice rough with emotion. "With you, it's a home. Real home, like I'd given up hoping for." He took her hands in his calluses. "Meeting calluses, stay, not just for now, for always. You and James, be my family proper." Tears spilled down Annalyn's cheeks, but her smile outshone them. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying all the weight of their shared journey. "Boone." pulled her close, their embrace saying everything words couldn't. The moment stretched sweet and perfect until James's voice shattered it with perfect timing. "Mama, the biscuits are ready," called from the doorway. "And I didn't burn a single one this time." Boone and Annalyn broke apart laughing. There, joy echoing across the yard where spring's first green shoots pushed through thawing earth. Like those tender plants, their love had taken root in winter's hardship and now promised to bloom in fullness. "Coming, sweetheart," Annalyn called back. She squeezed Boone's hand once more, then led him inside to where their son waited proudly by the warm stove, where the future beckoned with the simple comfort of shared supper and family. Bonds made stronger by choice than blood. Morning light spilled across the Colorado highlands, painting the spring grass in shades of gold. The new porch swing creaked softly as Boone, Annalyn, and James watched the sun climb over distant peaks. The air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and promise. "Hard to believe one stormy night changed everything," Boone mused, his deep voice gentle. He remembered the desperate knocking, the frozen figures at his door that winter evening that seemed so long ago now. Annalyn nestled closer against his shoulder, her touch as natural as breathing. "God works in unexpected ways," she said softly. "Sometimes he answers our prayers by opening doors we never thought to look for." The sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves drew their attention. Neighbors appeared along the road leading to the ranch, tools gleaming in the morning light. Men waved cheerfully, ready to help fence the new pasture Boone had planned for his expanding herd. James bounced with excitement at the sight of company. His cheeks glowed with health, no trace remaining of the fever that had nearly claimed him. He leaped from the porch, racing across dewy grass with the boundless energy of a child free from fear and shadow. A lone rider approached from the east, the Ute healer who had saved James's life. He tipped his hat as he passed, acknowledgement flowing between him and Boone like a silent river of restored friendship. Boone watched his son, for that's truly what James had become, chasing butterflies in the yard. The boy's laughter rang pure and clear as chapel bells across the morning air. Something caught in Boone's throat as he turned to Annalyn. "This ranch was empty too long," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "Now it's a home." The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces. Inside the ranch house, a lamp waited unlit on the kitchen table, ready for evening's gentle glow. Boone bowed his head, offering silent thanks for the family he'd found and the love that had transformed his solitary world into something rich with meaning. Through the open door, the aroma of coffee and fresh bread drifted out to embrace them, carrying the promise of countless shared mornings to come. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.